Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast, everybody. We've got a question today that feels like it's ripped straight from the headlines. Can a president-elect actually be stopped from taking office because of the Constitution itself?
Wow.
You, our listener, sent in some sources suggesting this isn't just a thought experiment. There's a real legal battle brewing. And it all comes down to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
To help us break it all down, we have with us a constitutional law expert. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks so much for having me. I think what's so interesting about this is it's so timely, right? We're not just talking about theory. These sources point to a specific case and debate unfolding right now as a new president is about to be sworn in.
Exactly. So for folks who haven't, memorized the Constitution, no judgment, by the way, could we get a plain English breakdown of what this Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is all about, especially the part that's causing all this commotion?
Sure. So Section 3 is essentially about disqualification from holding office, right? So it says if you've taken an oath to support the Constitution, but then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the U.S., you're out. No federal or state office for you. Unless, and here's a big guess, Congress gives you a pass. And we're talking a 2/3 majority vote kind of pass.
Okay, so that's the rule.
Yes.
But the sources use this term self-executing to describe it. And it kind of sounds like some legal booby trap. Like, what are they getting at with that? Does this mean someone is automatically disqualified the second they do something that's considered insurrection, like no trial, no nothing?
That's the big debate, right? Self-executing implies disqualification is automatic. It's right there in the Constitution, baked in. It wouldn't require a separate court case to say, yep, you did an insurrection, but... And this is important. Legal scholars argue whether it's really that straightforward. There could be pitfalls to that interpretation. And the Constitution doesn't exactly spell out the process.
So it's like this rule that everybody agrees on, but nobody's quite sure how to use it. This is starting to feel like one of those locked room mysteries, which leads us to some real-world drama. Our sources highlight this court case, Trump v. Anderson. So what was this case about? And how did it end up at the Supreme Court's doorstep?
Well, picture this, right? A group of voters in Colorado are convinced that a particular candidate, in this case Donald Trump, shouldn't even be on the ballot for the 2024 election. So they file suit arguing that his actions related to the January 6th Capitol riot fit the definition of insurrection, making him ineligible to hold office under Section 3. This case goes through the legal system, right, like a hot potato, and it finally lands in the Supreme Court's lap.
Okay, so everyone's holding their breath. The Supreme Court issues its ruling.
Yeah.
And what happens? Do they actually say whether Trump was disqualified or not?
Well, that's where it gets a little complicated, right? The Supreme Court was very specific in Trump v. Anderson. They basically sidestepped the question of whether Trump himself was disqualified. Instead, they focused on whether states had the power to remove a candidate from the ballot based on their interpretation of Section 3. And the court said, nope, states, that's not your call.
So not exactly a satisfying answer for those voters in Colorado, huh?
Right.
But hold on, if the states can't enforce this, who can?
Well, that's the thing. The court basically pointed the finger at Congress, saying Congress has the authority to enforce Section 3. So they left the door wide open on whether Trump or anyone else in a similar situation was actually disqualified.
Now my head is spinning. So the Supreme Court creates this legal puzzle, and then Congress is supposed to solve it. And here's where the sources throw in a real curveball. They say Congress could pass an amnesty bill
To remove the
disqualification, even if they never actually said someone was disqualified in the first place. Is that like legal gymnastics? Or is there some logic to that?
Well, this is where connecting the dots to the bigger picture gets really fascinating. What the sources seem to be saying is that Congress has this immense power, almost like a safety valve for the Constitution. They can choose to strictly uphold Section 3, or they can find ways around it, like this amnesty idea. And it really highlights how Congress's interpretation can shape the meaning of the Constitution.
Talk about a power play. This is getting intense. But before we go any further down this constitutional rabbit hole, let's take a quick breather. For all of you listening, make sure to subscribe and share this episode so you don't miss the rest of this wild ride. And hey, you can find Allison Knows on YouTube and Spotify too. Now back to the drama.
Let's say we've got this potentially disqualified person. They've won the election, and now it's time for the usually boring electoral college vote count. What happens if someone tries to raise the Section 3 issue right then and there?
Now we're getting into the real nail-biter scenario. The sources point to the electoral count. As this potential flashpoint, it's usually ceremonial, but in this case, it could become a showdown. Okay, so walk us through it. How could someone actually challenge a president-elect's qualifications right in the middle of this vote count? Is it like objecting at a wedding, or is there some kind of specific process?
It's not quite as simple as yelling, "I object," but there is a procedure. It requires both the House of Representatives and the Senate to get involved. If even just one member from each chamber objects to a state's electoral votes, both houses have to debate and then vote on whether to accept or reject those votes. And for that objection to hold, you need a majority vote in both chambers.
So it's a pretty high bar to clear then. You can't just be a lone voice shouting in the wilderness. But this also brings up the question of proof. Does the Constitution automatically put the burden on the person to prove that they are eligible? Or is it on those objecting to prove that they're not?
That's one of the gray areas the sources don't explicitly answer, actually. It's something legal scholars are still debating. Some say just the nature of Section 3 puts the burden on the individual. If there's a real question about their eligibility, they need to show they're in the clear. Others argue that the burden is on the challengers to present enough evidence to prove disqualification. It's tricky. And how this gets decided could have huge implications for how we use Section 3 in the future.
All right, so we've got this potential constitutional time bomb ticking away. Let's say, hypothetically, someone is disqualified, but they manage to become president anyway. What could happen? What are the stakes here?
Well, this is where the sources really start sounding the alarm. They talk about the potential for lasting damage to our whole system of government. There's this idea of habituation to constitutional violations. Basically, the more we let these things slide, even if they seem clear-cut, the less power the Constitution actually holds.
It's like we're slowly eroding the foundation of our democracy, bit by bit. And the sources don't sugarcoat it. They talk about the erosion of democratic norms, possible instability down the line, and even this crisis of legitimacy, where people just lose faith in our institutions. It's a scary thought.
Exactly. Imagine, right, a scenario where a disqualified individual is leading the country. What kind of message does that send? It sends the message that the Constitution is optional, that it's something you can pick and choose to follow. And that's a recipe for chaos.
And what about the idea of accountability if someone's actions truly disqualify them from holding office? Under the Constitution, shouldn't there be consequences, not just for their past actions, but to prevent this kind of thing from happening again?
That's a really key point the sources make, right? It's about drawing a line in the sand. If we let someone off the hook for something as serious as insurrection, it sets this dangerous precedent. It tells others that they can act against the government without facing any real repercussions.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Self-executing clauses, court cases, the role of Congress, the Electoral College count, even the potential consequences of inaction. But what does all of this mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into Section 3 of the 14th Amendment?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this isn't just some dusty legal relic, right? Section 3 is a powerful but complex tool for holding people accountable when they act against the government. And it forces us to think about, that balance of power in our government, what insurrection actually means in today's world, and what responsibility citizens have to defend the Constitution.
It's like the Constitution is this living document, constantly evolving as we face new challenges. And it requires all of us to stay informed and engaged to make sure it keeps working the way it's supposed to. We can't just take it for granted.
Absolutely. The sources remind us that ignoring or sidestepping the Constitution, even seemingly clear-cut parts like Section 3, can weaken the very core of our democracy. It's not something we can afford to be complacent about.
This conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. But before we wrap things up, I want to remind everybody to subscribe and share this episode with anyone who might be interested in this timely and important topic. You can also find the Allison Knows podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Now, for our final thoughts on this complex issue.
Well, we're clearly at a crossroads in our country's history. And these debates around Section 3 aren't just abstract legal discussions. They have real-world consequences for how we understand and uphold the Constitution, the peaceful transfer of power, and the future of American democracy.
You've hit the nail on the head. This isn't just about one court case or one president-elect. It's about the very principles that define our nation.
Yeah. It forces us to grapple with some tough questions, right? Like, what does it truly mean to uphold the Constitution? Who has the power to enforce it? And what are our responsibilities as citizens to make sure these principles endure for future generations?
It's a call to action for all of us to stay informed, engaged, and ready to defend the values at the heart of our democracy.
Precisely. The future of our democracy hinges on an informed and engaged citizenry, one that's willing to stand up. For the principles embodied in the Constitution, it's a shared responsibility, and we can't take it lightly.
This episode has been a whirlwind of information and ideas. And I have a feeling we'll all be thinking of this long after the episode ends. But before we sign off, let's leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question. If something as clear as Section 3 can be, ignored or maneuvered around, what does that say about the future of, our whole constitutional system? It's a big question, one that makes you think about the checks and balances that we have.
Yeah.
And whether they're, strong enough to make sure the Constitution stays relevant and powerful.
It is the question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer, no magic solution. But I think, recognizing that we the people have a voice, that our actions actually matter. The Constitution isn't some, self-enforcing robot. It needs engaged citizens, who are willing to hold their elected officials accountable, speak out against injustices, and demand that our leaders, stick to those core principles.
So it's a call to action, not just a history lesson. We need to be informed, engaged, and ready to stand up for the very foundation of our democracy.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and assume that things will work themselves out, right? We have this responsibility to understand our rights, use them, and make sure those in power are acting with transparency and integrity, and keep having these hard conversations about the challenges facing our country.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that democracy is a participatory sport. It's not something you just watch from the sidelines. We all have a part to play.
Absolutely. The future of our democracy is in the hands of an informed and engaged citizenry, people who are willing to defend those principles that are laid out in the Constitution. It's on all of us. And it's not a responsibility to be taken lightly.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It's been an eye-opening conversation, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to ponder.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our incredible listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive. Make sure you're subscribed and share this episode with anyone who might find this topic interesting and relevant. It's a big one. You can also catch Allison Knows on YouTube and Spotify. And don't forget to follow Allison on Blue Sky for even more deep dives and discussions. Thanks for listening to the Allison Knows podcast.